Professor David. Good morning. My name is Karine Prémont. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Sherbrooke, and I'm also deputy director of the Observatoire on the United States at la Chaire Raoul-Dandurand. And clearly this morning I have made a bad choice of shoes, so I hope everybody sees me. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce our two panelists for this panel entitled Checking and Balancing a Trump Presidency. So first of all, Professor Lichter is a professor of communication at George Mason University and the director of the Center for Media and Public Affairs. He also taught political science at Princeton, Georgetown, and George Washington Universities, and he was a research faculty member at Yale University and Columbia University. He received his PhD in government from Harvard University and many research awards. Professor Lichter has authored and co-authored 14 books and 100 scholarly articles and monographs on the news and entertainment media. From his book, there is among them The Media Elite, The Nightly News Nightmare, The Mediated Presidency, and it will be very nice to hear him today. Second of all, we have Olivier Barsalou, professor of law at UQAM. He is the author of The Diplomacy of the Universal, The Cold War, the United States, and the Genesis of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1945-1948. He received the Governor General's Gold Medal for Academic Merit, and he is also a regular contributor to the Quebec Journal of International Law. So without further ado, I'll let you enjoy these presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Although I must admit, since I live in the Washington, D.C. area, it's a great pleasure to be almost anybody, any place but there at the moment. I should say I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, which has already endeared me to the staff. It never used to bother me that the audience was always looking at the screen instead of me. When I started looking at the screen instead of the audience, I decided I'd better eliminate that. So, when I was asked to give a presentation on Donald Trump's relationship with the media, I thought this would either be a very, very long presentation or a very, very short one, depending on the way you looked at it. So I'll try to find a happy medium. We don't have happy media in the United States anymore, but at least a happy medium is achievable, I think. So the first thing to say about Donald Trump's relationship with the media is that this didn't start with Trump. Presidents have hated the media for a long time. Really, certainly since the 1960s and 1970s, when journalists became more activist, more engaged, more involved in social change, often challenging authority on Vietnam, civil rights, the feminist movement, and finally, most significantly, in Watergate. And presidents had to see them as a check on their own power, as something new and important that they had to deal with. This was primarily, I should say, Republican presidents, but Democrats as well. Bill Clinton actually tried to move the White House press room around the corner so they wouldn't have as easy access to staffers going down the corridor where it was located. Lyndon Johnson's problems with the media are well known. Johnson once ordered the FBI to do a background search on the journalist Morley Safer of CBS after Safer did a critical report on Vietnam. The FBI came back and said in response to Johnson's question, he's not a communist. And Johnson replied, I'm sorry, they said he's not a communist, he's a Canadian. And Johnson replied, I knew he wasn't an American. So, but I think the difference is that presidents come into office knowing they're going to compete with the media and trying to find out the best ways to do it. Donald Trump had a lot of experience with the media, primarily the entertainment media, the tabloid media, where he could basically use them as a source of publicity. And one clear thing is he had very little respect for the media coming in. So when he received a negative response from journalists, he viewed this as either a transgression of what he was supposed to be getting or as something that needed to be stopped as soon as possible. As a result, you have Trump first attacking particular news stories. We have phenomenon of fake news, which Donald Trump claims to have invented, not fake news himself, but as describing other people's fake news. We have an attack on the profession of journalism, journalists as, quote, the enemy of the people. I don't know whether Trump knows the reference or not, but that's a pretty scary reference. And finally, denying the press its First Amendment role as an arbiter of political reality. Basically, ultimately, Trump is fighting with the media to determine who tells people what political reality is. And it's not surprising that 4 days after his inauguration, the #1 best-selling book on Amazon was 1984 by George Orwell, about a regime in which words did mean exactly what the regime said they meant and nothing else. So in a way, if I can drop one more literary reference on you, in a way you could say everything about Donald Trump that you need to know is explained by an exchange in Alice Through the Looking Glass, the sequel to Alice in Wonderland, in which Alice is talking to Humpty Dumpty, who says, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And Alice replies, the question is whether you can make words mean so many different things. And Humpty replies, the question is which to be master, which is to be master, that is all. Who will be the master of reality? And as a result, you have Trump, #1, entering this siege warfare with journalists. #2, changing fundamentally the way journalists had to work, because journalists are fond of saying that journalism is the first rough draft of reality, of history. And of course today, social media are the first rough draft of history. And Donald Trump has taken great advantage of that in his use of Twitter. He knows exactly what he's doing. Some people in his staff told him he should cut it down after he took the presidency because it made him seem less presidential. Trump has good instincts on how to present himself and how to fight his enemies. So he stuck with Twitter. He hasn't yet been hurt by it. And I think the most recent development, that now the number of characters is doubled, we will have twice as much controversy coming out of Donald Trump's use of Twitter. At the same time, Trump, by using Twitter, works with something that psychologists know very well, which is that people construct reality for themselves in a way that makes it easy to continue believing what you already believe and hard to believe something different from what you do now. That we know that people tend to seek out information from sources they already trust. They remember things from those media, from those sources. They remember things in terms of what they already believe. They sort things out in terms of what the media tell them that they already believe. And finally, they forget the source of information that they have learned. So it is very easy for someone to, in all goodwill, go out and search for information, naturally searching for information where they most respect it, where they most trust it, to then, from the information, glean and remember the material that already agrees with what they agree, and in the end, forget that they have a highly stylized and one-sided view of information, and to go on merrily about their way, assuming that they are good citizens and not changing their views based on contradictory information in the media. When we talk about Trump playing to his base, that is a perfect tool for playing to your base. The people that already believe what you believe are probably going to continue believing it, particularly if you manage to demonize the sources that would make them change. Whether this is a recipe for re-election, since Trump's base is in the 30-something%, is another question. But in terms of the dynamics of the president, the Congress, other political actors, and the public, that tells us that we're in for a bumpy ride for the next few years as the media try to challenge Trump's version of reality, and much of the public is ready to continue believing what they already believe. Trump is not likely to convert Hillary Clinton supporters, but neither is he likely to be abandoned by his supporters. And presently I'll get to that, some data on that point. Beyond the use of Twitter, Trump, I think certainly in modern history, Trump has waged continuous total warfare against journalists to a degree never seen, not even in the Nixon administration, in which at one point during Watergate, a Washington Post reporter was talking to Attorney General John Mitchell, who eventually would see the criminal justice system from the inside, but at that time was Attorney General. And he told him about a story that was going to run. And the Attorney General of the United States replied, "If you run that, we'll put Kate Graham's tit in a ringer." Mrs. Graham, the owner of the Washington Post. And incidentally, a quick plug, there's about to be a movie called The Post about the Pentagon Papers with Tom Hanks as editor Ben Bradley and Meryl Streep, how could you forget Meryl Streep, as Mrs. Graham, which I look forward to with a great deal of interest. After telling you that journalists are under siege, I have good news, and that is we're in the early days of siege warfare, where it was very difficult to win before cannons started breaking down walled structures. So the results of this effort by Trump have been mixed at best. We know, for example, that the latest poll on Trump's popularity with the general public has him down below 40%. That is, 59%, I think, are critical of Trump. 39% agree with him. That is the lowest rating of any president after 10 months since polling started in the Truman administration. Moreover, there's a wonderful website called 538 that puts up information, gives you the polling numbers for every president back to Truman, and lets you overlay the polling numbers for Trump on any one of those. This is the first 10 months of 10 administrations, is about 3,000 days. And out of those 3,000 collective days, Trump has managed to find about a week's worth of time in which he had higher ratings than any of the previous 10 presidents. So something is out there that is blocking Trump. And I think it's clear that it's the media. We know, for example, that in the general election, Trump had the worst coverage, the most negative coverage by major media of any president certainly since I started doing these studies back in the 1980s. In the first 100 days of his administration, he had the worst coverage of any incoming president since these studies started, since I started doing these studies, again, in the 1980s. His coverage during his first 100 days in major media was 80% negative. Nobody has ever approached that sort of thing. So even though Trump is trying to decertify journalism as a presenter of political reality, journalism is biting back, and biting back successfully. I would, however, add a coda that the danger to journalism is that journalists, by taking on Trump so directly, will end up decertifying their own authority by being seen as oppositional, hysterical, and unfair. For example, a Washington Post column on Trump was headlined, "A hellscape of lies and distorted reality awaits journalists covering President Trump." I think that's probably a little strong. Whether it is or not, it's going to leave a lot of people saying, you know, they're just against him. I'm not going to listen to this. In fact, a Gallup poll last year found that public trust in the media is down to its lowest levels ever. 32% of the public say they trust the media, the lowest since Gallup began doing these polls in 1972. So the media have to deal with what I'd call the tar baby problem. It's an old American folklore. There's a story about a fox who couldn't catch a rabbit. And finally, he built a creature, something that looked like an animal, out of tar supported by wood. The rabbit walked up the street, said hello to the tar baby, didn't get anything back. He said, hello, didn't get anything back. Finally said, what's the matter with you? You don't acknowledge me? Pushed him and stuck in the tar. And said, what are you doing? What? And his hand stuck in the tar. And eventually, instead of trying to chase the rabbit, the fox walked up to him and said, this is how it's done. So the danger is that you get stuck on the wrong side of that tar baby. But I will say, if journalists do it, which time? Okay, I can do it in a couple of minutes. If journalists do it right, on the other hand, manage to be critical without seeming hysterical, then Donald Trump gets left with the problem, I'd call it the Marx Brothers problem. There's an old routine by the Marx Brothers. A wife walks into a hotel room, sees her husband in bed with another woman. She says, who is that woman? And the husband, in this case Groucho Marx, says, what woman? And she says, what? That woman, I can see her with my own eyes. And he replies, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? On that note, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Olivier Barsalou. I'm a professor at the Department of Law here at UQAM. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais juste prendre quelques instants pour remercier la Chaire Raoul-Dandurand, Frédéric, pour son invitation, Julie Pierre, Françoise pour la coordination, fait un travail formidable, puis ainsi que toute l'équipe. Je pense que c'est un magnifique événement. Et merci aussi aux panélistes, surtout ceux de ce matin. C'était fantastique, j'ai appris énormément. Now we'll switch back to English. Frédéric invited me to speak about Trump and the law, and honestly, my first reaction was he's not aware of it, but I panicked. I suffer from asthma, and I think I had like an attack or something like that. And you can see it in my eyes. I felt exactly the same like last night at 2 o'clock in the morning in my bed. It's just like I was still thinking about how am I going to make sense of all the things that are happening right now? And honestly, I'm not entirely sure if it still makes sense, but I'll try to provide you, let's say, some meaning and probably some hope. Because, I mean, my entire craft as a lawyer depends on it. So, I mean, we have to fight for the system, otherwise I'm going to run out of job. So what today I'm going to do is just try to provide you with a brief overview on some of the legal issues that have arisen since the election of President Trump. And you know, there are tons of it. And so, and please, students, don't listen to it, but I randomly pick just a few topics. So there's nothing scientific here. Because I don't want to be exhaustive, and in any case, I can't be exhaustive in 15 minutes. But what I want to do is just provide you with a perspective on how we can make sense of it and how law and legal institution can act and the sort of role they fulfill in the face of Trump policies. And so, with my title, right, as Trump's, okay, I intended in the beginning it was a joke, but as some of my students will probably confirm, most of my jokes fall flat most of the time. So, but the idea behind that is it's an idea as well as how we can understand the functioning of law and legal institutions. And in this case, what I want to suggest, and it's right as Trump, is an old idea in liberal legal philosophy. It's an idea that's been promoted by the late Ronald Dworkin, who's a hero of my craft. And the idea here is simple. It's just to say that law, rights, individual rights and civil liberties, and legal institution can trump and override, ultimately, policy decision. I'm just thinking of the Establishment Clause and freedom of religion that was invoked to oppose and to contest the constitutionality of the travel ban ordered by President Trump. So the question I'm asking this morning for the next 12 minutes, it's, do U.S. legal institutions can trump Trump's policy? And my response is, yes, I think so. And just to make sure, sometimes the stuff I think can overlap with the stuff I hope for. So, but I just want to be clear about that. So my analysis is based on a very cursory understanding of some of the main issues we've seen arising. And I must say at the outset, I might be totally wrong, so feel free to contest me and to bring some other example that I might not thought of in this presentation. So for my overview, I just want to provide you like a cursory view of the three main branches of the government: the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive. And I'll start with the judiciary, which for the Federalists and the Founding Father was considered as the least dangerous branch. And I must say that for Trump, it's probably the most dangerous. The Trump administration has already had the chance to fill a seat at the Supreme Court last April when it nominated Neil Gorsuch to replace and to succeed Antonin Scalia, another conservative judge. So far, this nomination has not, for what I know, has not broken the fragile liberal-conservative balance on the court. At worst, and I'm taking the words of Jeffrey Toobin, who wrote an article very recently, The New Yorker, Neil Gorsuch is, in the worst-case scenario, just an annoying justice working on the bench, annoying to his colleagues. But that's the worst we have seen so far from this nomination. The thing here is that aside, and the annoyance of Neil Gorsuch for his colleagues, that aside, we still await Gorsuch effects. And here, the long-awaited Supreme Court decision in Gessner versus Arab Bank, you may have never heard of it, but it has the potential to be a turning point in this case in Trump judiciary nomination. And so it's a case about whether a multinational corporation has human rights obligation abroad and the extent of U.S. jurisdiction. So it's a very technical case, but most human rights defenders around the world and in Canada are awaiting this decision, and because it might be an important breakthrough in the field of human rights and whether they can be applied extraterritorially. So we still wait, and probably the decision will be rendered later this year or early next year. But Where Trump probably will have a lasting impact is it started on September 7 when he nominated 16 new federal judges. These nominations went through seamlessly in the Senate Judiciary Committee. But here, the issue here is not about the inherent qualities or qualification of these individuals, but it has to do with their lasting effect, because they're nominated for life for position that is really, really important in the federal judiciary structure. And here, as such, it can have a lasting impact on the interpretation of the Constitution, the interpretation of the law, and the exercise of civil rights and civil liberties, and this interpretation can last for generations. And this is where we have to wait and see what's going to happen. But for the moment, no one, either on both the Democratic side or the Republican side, have criticized these nominations. So we're still in the wait-and-see position. So, for instance, from the view from the judiciary and the recent nomination, there's not much to fear in terms of from Trump. Where Trump might be got scared at some point is from the law or from the lawsuits. Comes from the lawsuits that there've been a flurry of lawsuits that have been brought around the country against Trump policies. And here we have to understand lawsuits not simply as just like mere legal technicalities. I mean, here I'm borrowing from Clausewitz, and you have to see lawsuits as a tool or a mean to pursue politics by other means. And in this case, I refer to the Attorney General General Attorney of California, Javier Becerra, who filed a lawsuit against Trump's project to build a wall in California. And so he objected and is contesting the constitutionality of the construction of the wall. And we have also to wait for the court's decision around the country, whether on the local courts, on the federal courts, to see how they will react to the travel ban. And we have to wait as well because for the dismantling of environmental protection, there's a lot of contestation going on before courts. But decisions in these cases will probably be rendered within the next 12 or 18 months. But still, I think the idea here is not to suggest that courts will answer and protect American people against some of the Trump's policy. But the idea here is just to say that courts can be a space where political activism can be, and political activists can mobilize to contest Trump's policy. And so in this case, we can reasonably expect and to put it mildly, that courts will be called to act as trumps against Trump policy. The second aspect I want to look at with you is the legislative branch. And here, in this case, I want to focus on a very tiny, specific presidential practice. So generally, presidents, when they run and when they campaign on the promise to be to uphold the Constitution, and they often state that they will not issue statements to revise legislative intent. And that's a promise that Obama formulated in 2008, and yet he largely continued this practice of unilateral action, which can impact appropriation, among other things. So signing statements here are official pronouncements by the president that are issued when he signs a bill into law. And this is a practice that has been denounced by the American Bar Association for several years, and that has been used by George W. Bush about 171 times, by Bill Clinton about 390 times, and by Obama several, but much less than Bush and Clinton. And so far, Trump has used the signing statement 6 times. And on August 2nd, he made a statement that it's very peculiar. And here I quote him. "I sign into law the Countering America's Adversary Through Sanction Act, which enacts new sanctions on Iran, North Korea, and Russia." And this is the interesting part. "Still, the bill remains seriously flawed, especially because it encroaches on the executive branch's authority to negotiate." Here, the issue here is just to remind the president that there's something called the Congress, which Professor Rolf referred to earlier. But the idea here is just not only to highlight the mismatch between the president and the Congress, but to highlight as well that the Congress probably is intending on constraining or limiting Trump's foreign policy adventures here. And the Congress as such can act as a trump and fulfill what is obligation under the Constitution. So here, for Trump, again, the constitutional text and the duties of the legislative branch can act as a trump against his policy. One last example I want to use is, refer to, is the executive branch. We have talked a lot about, and probably we'll talk about that later today, about the NAFTA and the negotiation of possibly a new agreement. And here it's important to be reminded that Trump cannot unilaterally, I think, in my opinion, abrogate that agreement. He needs the support of the Congress because of the nature of the NAFTA agreement in U.S. constitutional law. And as Melissa referred earlier, the same logic applies as well to the Iran deal. He cannot make a decision and abrogate this agreement concluded with the P5 and European powers and with Iran unilaterally. He needs the support of the Congress because the Congress was responsible for implementing this agreement and making into law in U.S. law. So just to conclude, I just want to remind you there's, on the top of the three branches, there's a fourth branch of the government, which is the bureaucracy. And here it's important to be reminded that it's just not about policies, it's not about deciding, it's about implementing these policies. And here we've seen at the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Justice, Department of Interior, Department of State, individual civil servants rising up and opposing and acting as trumps against Trump policy in this case because they believe that it was their duty to act like that and to protect the integrity of the constitutional system here. Second element, or concluding element, I just want to remind you there that the Trump administration is under investigation. I think I can stop here. It's fairly obvious. And so in the end, what I want to say is it's partly because of my craft and I'm biased and utterly prejudiced, and I'm sorry for that. But law still matters here. And Trump and his administration cannot do and act as they wish. There are constraints, there are constitutional constraints, and here rights and law, I think, can trump Trump, but slowly. And so we have to be patient and we have to wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. So there is a lot of material to start a discussion, but I think we have a little time. How much do we have? 15 minutes?
And 30 seconds.
15 minutes and 30 seconds. So I'll let you speak. I'll let you ask questions. I'll ask two things from you, to be brief and to be specific, so we could have the best discussion possible. So just go to the microphone.
Hello, my name is Dominique. I study at doing a master's in international relations at UQAM. In fact, Olivier was my professor last year. And my question is for him. So it's kind of strange to speak English with Olivier, but anyway. It's a rather technical question, so it's probably going to be a fast answer. I was wondering about the burden of proof in cases where courts file lawsuits against Trump policies. So for example, when courts decided that the travel ban was non-constitutional, I'm wondering whether it's Trump's administration's burden to prove that the policies are constitutional, or if it's up to the courts to prove that they're non-constitutional or discriminatory. And I tried really hard to ask my question without using the word discriminatory because it's really hard to say for a French speaker.
Merci Dominique pour la question. Usually, it just as a matter of procedure, usually it's individuals, either government officials or private individuals who can file lawsuits against government policies before court, either local or federal court. The issue here is that the burden of proof rests with the Trump administration, and that's why the travel ban has been transformed and redrafted several times, because the issue here is a matter of discrimination, and there's a test called strict scrutiny, more or less, in issues when it comes to evaluating whether government policy is discriminatory. And so here with the test of strict scrutiny, so the government, as to justify its policy and to make it legal in this regard, has to basically say, well, this is a thing that of the utmost importance that we have to do first, so it has to explain why. And the second thing, the measure and the policy we're implementing is the only mean we have to do that. And in both cases, for both aspects of this test, the Trump administration failed in Hawaii and elsewhere. And that's why they redrafted it to include, among other countries, Venezuela, in order to exclude the religious aspect of the travel ban. But here, the burden of proof rests with the government.
Thank you.
Hello. This question is about the media. I would like a little bit more explanation about why the usage of Twitter, considering the percentages that you presented to us, why the usage has been effective, and what this increase in the number of characters from 140 to 2,080 would represent. I mean, I have like this question much more detailed. Maybe you can provide us with your forecast, because the brevity and the succinctness of these emails, of these tweets, probably were effective in a way that I would like you to understand better why you consider the usage effective, and how this can, I mean, how the discussion in the social media can go forward. I mean, but this is a forecast, right? With this increase, not only by him, but also by his followers and by his detractors in Twitter. Which seems to me that it's driving now public opinion in a very important extent.
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure what the effect of doubling the characters will be in general. It can be said that brevity is one of the great virtues, if one considers it a virtue of Twitter, and accounts for much of the attention. But when a president of the United States uses Twitter, anything a president says is news. If he has twice as much to say, particularly if Donald Trump has something to say and can go on for twice as long, I think that's going to increase the news-making ability that he has. And it may, believe it or not, may even make him more unvarnished in the way that he relates to people through Twitter, because he has, more to do, and he tends to go on and on. Now with Twitter he can only go on. Now he'll be able to go on and 1.5 anyway. But I think the important thing to note is that Twitter is greatly important in general in terms of changing the dynamic of the media, that people now get their news from each other instead of from gatekeepers who tell you what's going to be news. So that there's a whole literature on the importance of you're well aware of that, I'm sure. But again, with the President of the United States, Trump has managed to solve a problem that has vexed presidents at least since the beginning of the television age in the 1950s. Drove presidents crazy that they would give a speech and then reporters would get up and say, well, the president said this, and that's really nothing new, and the president said that, but he's being criticized. And presidents thought, what can I do to get my message out over the media, beyond the media? And they tried various things. They went to local media outlets that were generally more respectful. They would give televised speeches where at least they could get a talk out before the so-called instant analysis, which presidents hate. Trump has finally found a way to set the agenda. The agenda setters were the traditional media. The gatekeepers were the traditional media. The gates are now wide open. Trump sets the agenda because he determines what is said and thought about, his feelings, his policies. He's number one. The journalists are reacting to him. And that's something we haven't seen before. And I would predict whoever is president in the future, just as we know in the past, Howard Dean showed that you could use the internet for fundraising. Barack Obama showed that you could use the internet for organization and communication. Trump has shown that you can use social media to set the political agenda in a way that no other president has been able to do. And I think prospective future presidents are already trying to figure out how they can do that themselves.
Claude Giroux, I have a question also about the media. You mentioned that public confidence in the media or in journalism is pretty low right now. Yet on the other hand, I hear that some famous, very good newspapers such as the New York Times and the Washington Post are having tremendous increases in their readership, and a lot of people, they're building up their staff. And how do you reconcile these two things?
Well, it's the difference between the media in general and the New York Times and the Washington Post in particular. I mean, the New York Times is a journal of record. I mean, they self-consciously, when everybody else was cutting back and cost-cutting, the Times added staff. Even then, when there was a brief time when it looked like they really might go under, they needed to take a huge loan to keep operating. But when people say the media, it's become almost a term of opprobrium. They mean the media that I don't like. I would say that people actually, they like the news. They like getting the news. They don't much like journalists, and they hate the media. So that it's entirely possible for someone to say, yes, you know, this newspaper is fine, not like the rest of the media that doesn't agree with what I have to say. So I think that's the general dynamic that would account for that.
Thank you. Okay.
Nicholas, as well as international relations, I studied international law in the Brady program at UQAM. So this is a law question. I would like to know more about, you were saying there's a lawsuit against the constitutionality of the wall.
Yeah.
And I'd like to understand like the details.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. Merci pour ça. So it's a lawsuit that was brought by the California Attorney General, Javier Becerra. And so the lawsuit is available online. It came up like about 5-6 weeks ago. And here I just like, I think this is like a real political move. So maybe he has a personal agenda attached to it. So that's one thing, but I can't confirm that. Yeah, there's a California or state agenda as well involved in there. And the other thing is that the suit it's really clear and explicit about that. The Attorney General evokes rights to circulate, to control economic activities on the Californian territory. It evokes as well environmental issues, so free circulation of animals, protection of reserves and stuff like that, access to water, and that which might be affected by the construction of the wall. But so basically it's a prosperity of California, protection of the environment, and the highly discriminatory aspect of the construction of the wall. These are the three main pillars on which rests this lawsuit. I can't go into the details, but I think it's going to be too technical. But basically this is the logic underlying it.
Yes, I have a question as well. Considering the many laws that you have stated, I mean, is there a possibility that the fact that we have to wait approximately like 12 to 18 months for these laws to be reviewed and taken in effect, is there a possibility that the administration does simply too much damage for anything to be reversible, or just like a similar comparison to what we said with the nuclear codes, where Congress would have a possibility of stopping whenever a president would launch a nuke? Well, in that case, it would take too much time to deliberate, and 30 minutes, like stated before. So to the question, I mean, is those laws that are going to be in effect 18 to 12 months from now, is there a possibility that they're simply going to be ineffective?
Yeah, sure. That's for sure. We can see the damage has been done, and sometimes it's about correcting the damage, offering reparation and stuff like that. So the law cannot stop necessarily Trump from pursuing his policies and going full steam ahead. The issue here is just sometimes in many cases, courts can produce what we call injunction, stopping, let's say, the construction of the wall in certain areas and stuff like that. So they have means, courts have means, but the issue here is whether they can be enforced and implemented. And that's another issue here, because it connects with the executive, either the federal branch or the state branch of the executive. And so here we have to see whether court's injunction, for instance, in the case of the wall, can be implemented. But with regard to the travel ban, it took less than 24 hours for judges to react and declare the ban unconstitutional. And so it can have an effect here. But here I see it not necessarily as an institutional or necessarily as a technical legal thing, but I think of the judiciary and the courts and the role of the law as a new place, a new space that can be mobilized to pursue political goals. And as such, it can be used to gather people around the project in opposition to some of Trump's policies. And in that sense, it can have an immediate effect on political mobilization against Trump policies. So there are different ways to look at it from a sociological perspective, a legal technical perspective. From the technical perspective, yeah, we have to be patient and you need to bring the popcorn here.
Je vais juste donner la parole à Mme Baudouin que j'ai oubliée tantôt. Alors, mes excuses, allez-y et je vous reviens ensuite.
Okay, so I'm doing my master in political science, but I'm also a journalist, so my question will be about the media. If you can talk to us about how the mainstream media are using tweets and things from social media to make news. It was the case during the election. Every day was Trump tweet was the headlines. Are they making a mistake? Should they ignore it? What can they do about that?
Yeah, well, journalists have figured out if you can't beat them, join them. That you can't beat the timeliness of Twitter. So tweeting out news becomes a way of competing with Twitter. I once had a study that I was trying hard to place, and people were saying, I don't really have room for it. And finally, a journalist said, I'll just tweet it out for you. And he said, in little pieces, which worked very well. People waiting for the next little piece. I think the general crisis for traditional journalism caused by digital media isn't that journalism is worse or that people don't care anymore. It's that journalists can't figure out how to monetize their product the way that they used to. I think tweeting is something that journalists have to learn to do. The problem is, for journalists, the danger that they will start tweeting their own opinions. Many journalists have gotten into trouble saying things that delegitimize them as objective journalists by going too far. And various newspapers have now lots of different rules about what you can and can't tweet. So I think just as I said with the dangers of journalism going too far in criticizing Trump and kind of making his point, I think with Twitter, it's a matter of using this weapon without turning it on yourself.
Thank you.
Allez-y.
Oui, bonjour à vous. Et je vous remercie tous les deux pour vos interventions. Mon nom est Harry, je suis biochimiste de formation. Et ma question s'adresse au professeur Barsalou. Je suis tout à fait d'accord pour les poursuites judiciaires et la résistance des juges fédéraux. Donc, tout à fait d'accord, mais j'ai une réserve à l'égard de la bureaucratie, la fonction publique. Est-ce que selon Julien Banda, dans sa fameux ouvrage La trahison des clercs, un tel politique serait une invitation au chaos. Vous ne pensez pas?
Merci pour votre question. So just to summarize it and rephrase it in English, I think correct me if I'm wrong, but basically my call to, or me suggesting that the bureaucracy can act as a trump against Trump, it might not be a call for chaos and bureaucratic domination. There are two things I'd like to say about that. First of all, it's something I should have mentioned at the outset, but calling upon the bureaucracy to act as a trump it means that there's a serious problem and we're in a very special situation here. There's something weird going on in terms of politics, but as well in terms of legal politics here. And so it just highlights the fact that we're probably out of resources, I mean, for the moment, we lawyers or legal students, to answer what Trump's policy. And that's the first thing. The second thing is that has to do with my title, right as Trump. This is not a normative claim I make. In fact, I think it's a relatively conservative, liberal perspective on the function of law and rights in the society. But still, we are back in the trenches, and this is probably one of the last resources and claim we can make against Trump's policy. And here, it just highlights the fact that some of the first resources and munitions we have are already depleted. And so we have to fall back onto other exceptional or something that we had not yet envisioned, or probably we had feared, like the growth of bureaucracy, for instance. And so it just highlights the fact that with me, I think in my understanding, we feel and we're running out of resources and we have to fall back on stuff and ideas, concepts, and institutions that we otherwise would have not mobilized against Trump. And so it just highlights the peculiarity of the situation we're in right now. Hope it answers.
Une dernière question pour monsieur,
bonjour.
allez-y.
Mon nom est Jean-Claude Boivin, je suis retraité. Ma question est pour monsieur Barsalou. C'est concernant une poursuite qu'il y a eu contre le président Trump sur un potentiel conflit d'intérêts avec ses activités et le gouvernement. Je voudrais avoir, est-ce qu'il y a des suites là-dessus?
Merci pour votre question. Regarding the Russian case, and so the idea here is that it's to ask whether there is a follow-up on Trump's investigation over Trump's maybe connection with foreign interests, and whether he was bribed or received gift that may impact. Is that a question? May impact his policy? I just want to make sure we're referring to this same issue.
Étant donné qu'il y a des hôtels et beaucoup d'entreprises comme ça, est-ce que le président peut potentiellement avoir un conflit d'intérêts? Il profite de la situation de ces entreprises tout en étant président?
Yeah, definitely. And this problem is still on the table right now. And I think there's an investigation going on, but the issue here is to be able, before you engage either in impeachment procedure or file for criminal indictment, you have to be able to prove that and the connection. And here, if you go with the criminal procedure, you need a very, very high level of proof that connect directly Trump individually, or either its close associates with these interests. And this, for the moment, I don't think anyone has been able to show that, and with certainty. And so maybe Ralph has some privileged information regarding this, but for what I know, I don't think we have these proof. There are rumors, there are suspicions, but we don't have the proof right now, so we cannot. No one, a general prosecutor cannot cannot indict President Trump for bribery and stuff like that in these cases. So it's really hard to connect it, and that's a problem. That's the main problem, and that's a problem that the Mueller investigation will face at some point when they try to reach to Donald Trump. I don't know if it answers. Yeah.
Alors malheureusement, c'est tout le temps qu'on a. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.